Welcome to Life Stories, where we bring you the most inspiring and heart-touching narratives from all walks of life. Today, we begin a journey of resilience, courage, and self-discovery through the unexpected friendship between Emma and Margaret Blackwell. A woman once at the pinnacle of the financial world, now forgotten by many, in a world where people are quick to judge and slow to understand. Emma's empathy leads her to uncover the truth that could change both their lives forever. Join us as we dive into this powerful story. Don't forget to subscribe to our channel to start today's story. It was a crisp morning in Manhattan when I first noticed her. The old woman, her silver hair catching the dim light of the coffee shop, looked like she had seen the world, and yet, the world seemed to have forgotten her. Margaret Blackwell, as I would come to know her, stood in front of the cafe door with trembling hands, struggling to reach for the handle. She was in her 80s, hunched over, with a frail body that seemed to weigh more than it should. I watched as she pushed the door open, her weary eyes scanning the bustling coffee shop. The sudden quiet that followed her entrance was more than just the soft clink of the door closing. It was an uncomfortable silence, filled with whispered glances and sideways looks. A few patrons exchanged knowing glances, their eyes narrowing as they quickly returned to their conversations or avoided looking at her altogether. The barista, a young man with an air of practiced politeness, gave her a forced smile that faltered for a brief moment before being replaced with a stiff, professional grin. "Mrs. Blackwell, the usual?" he asked, though his voice lacked any warmth. Margaret nodded, her shoulders hunched further under the weight of the judgment she had carried with her for so long. She reached into her worn purse, carefully counting out coins with shaking hands. I couldn't help but notice the precision with which she did it. Each coin was placed on the counter with meticulous care. And yet, the line behind her grew longer, impatient sighs floating in the air like a cold breeze. People behind her tsked checked their watches, and shifted their weight from foot to foot, making no effort to hide their discomfort. I could see the tremble in Margaret's hands grow more pronounced, her fingers struggling under the weight of their impatience. "Could you move to the pickup area, ma'am?" The barista's voice was kind, but his patience was thin. It was at that moment I saw her face so full of life and yet so filled with sorrow. She turned to make her way toward the small corner table she always sat at. Her steps were slow, deliberate, but with each movement, she seemed more fragile than before. There was a certain dignity about her, though, something that seemed at odds with her appearance. She was an old woman, but not one who seemed to have been defeated by time. I had only been coming to this cafe for a few weeks now, nursing the cheapest coffee they had while sending out resumes on my laptop. My clothes were secondhand, and my shoes had seen better days. In this neighborhood, no one was kind to the outcasts, people like me, who didn't fit in with the polished facade of Manhattan's finest. But something about Margaret's presence made me feel a strange connection to her. It wasn't just her age, or her obvious struggle to fit in with the people around her. It was something deeper. Maybe it was the way people refused to acknowledge her humanity, as though being old and frail meant she didn't matter anymore. And yet, there was a quiet strength in the way she carried herself. As I watched her settle into the last empty seat, I couldn't shake the feeling that there was more to this woman than met the eye. I couldn't help myself. I had to speak up when a man in an expensive suit approached her table. "You're in my spot," he said, his voice thick with entitlement. Margaret looked up at him, confusion crossing her lined face. "I don't see a reservation sign," she said quietly, her voice trembling but firm. "I always sit here at this time," the man insisted, his voice rising just slightly. "I need the table for a business meeting." I felt a pang of sympathy for her, and before I could stop myself, I found myself speaking up. "There are no assigned seats here," I said, surprising even myself with my boldness. "And she was here first." The man turned to me, his eyes scanning me from head to toe, taking in my worn clothes and my cheap laptop. "And who exactly are you?" he sneered. "Someone who believes in basic courtesy," I replied, my heart hammering in my chest. I wasn't sure why I was standing up for this woman, but I couldn't let him treat her like that. He scoffed but turned away, retreating to another table. Margaret, startled by my intervention, looked at me with wide, watery blue eyes. "Thank you, dear," she said softly. "You didn't have to do that." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me despite the awkwardness of the moment. "It wasn't right," I said simply. "You deserve to sit wherever you like." Margaret offered her hand to me, her fingers calloused, a sharp contrast to her refined manner of speech. "I'm Margaret Blackwell. It's nice to meet you." Her name took me by surprise. I'd heard it before, of course, on the news. In the business section, on those rare occasions when someone in the financial world was discussed. Margaret Blackwell had been a powerful figure in the business world, known for her sharp mind and even sharper business acumen. I never expected to meet her in a place like this, looking as though she had been forgotten by the very people who had once revered her. "I'm Emma Fisher," I said, shaking her hand. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Blackwell." Her eyes softened as she looked at me. "Do you live nearby?" she asked, her voice tinged with something I couldn't quite place, sadness, maybe, or longing. I hesitated, unsure of how much to reveal. Well, I've been job hunting," I admitted, giving a self-deprecating smile. "I have an accounting degree, but no one's hiring." Her gaze sharpened then, a flicker of interest passing through her eyes. "Accounting, you say?" she mused. "From which university?" "State," I replied. It wasn't anything fancy, but I graduated top of my class. Her lips quirked, and I could see a spark of approval in her eyes. "Excellence is excellence, regardless of the institution," she said firmly. I like that. It was then that I realized how little I knew about Margaret Blackwell. Her life, once filled with power and prestige, had crumbled, and yet she still carried herself with such grace, such dignity. It made me wonder what had happened, what caused the fall from grace that I had heard whispers about. But for now, all I could do was listen as she shared bits and pieces of her past with me, carefully leaving out the most important details. For the rest of the hour, we talked, and as I listened to her, I couldn't help but feel that I had stumbled upon something deep and meaningful. Something that would change my life forever. The next morning, I woke up with a strange sense of anticipation. As I dressed quietly in the early hours, I couldn't stop thinking about Margaret Blackwell. The cafe encounter had left me with more questions than answers. Who was she really? What had happened to her? I had spent hours searching online for any news about her, but it was almost as if she had vanished from the public eye, leaving behind only rumors and whispers. Margaret had mentioned a property not far from the cafe, but when I probed further, she had avoided elaborating, her answer brief and evasive. Still, something about her response lingered with me, urging me to push past the polite facade I had seen in that coffee shop and uncover more. I was determined to learn the truth behind the mysterious woman whose once towering reputation seemed to have crumbled into obscurity. The cafe was quieter when I arrived that morning, the usual morning rush replaced by a few early patrons nursing their coffees. I found Margaret sitting at our usual table, her fragile hands wrapped around a steaming cup, her coat slightly more worn than the day before. Despite her age and frailty, she carried herself with an elegance that made me question everything I thought I knew about her. She had always worn the same quiet confidence, even when others around her had clearly written her off. "Good morning, Emma," she greeted me, sliding a cup toward me with a soft smile. I took the liberty of ordering your usual. I blinked in surprise. "Thank you," I said, taking the cup with a soft smile of my own. "You didn't have to do that." She waved her hand dismissively. "Nonsense. It's the least I can do after your kindness yesterday." Her eyes twinkled slightly, and I saw a glimmer of warmth in her expression that contrasted sharply with the woman I had seen just hours earlier. This was someone who had lived a life of power, a woman who had tasted both triumph and loss. We settled into a quiet conversation, the noise of the cafe fading into the background as we spoke. I listened as Margaret shared pieces of her life, speaking with a quiet reverence for the past she could no longer reclaim. But there was something more to her story, something hidden beneath the surface of her words. "Why are you still in this neighborhood?" I asked, my curiosity getting the better of me. "If you own property, I would have thought you'd live somewhere more fitting." Her expression faltered for a moment, her eyes growing distant. "I don't live here anymore." "Not really," she answered quietly, her voice carrying a weight that made me pause. "Circumstances have changed. Life has a way of humbling even the most powerful." I didn't press her further. I could see she wasn't ready to reveal more. And yet, there was a deep sadness in her voice that told me everything I needed to know. Margaret had been someone important once, someone who had commanded respect. And now, she was little more than a forgotten relic of a past life. As we spoke, a man in a sharp suit approached our table, his face set in an expression of disdain. I watched as he approached with the air of entitlement that seems so common in places like this. Without a hint of politeness, he addressed Margaret. "You're in my seat," he snapped. His tone was dismissive, his eyes scanning the room for sympathy. But none came. The other patrons remained silent, unwilling to intervene. I was beginning to see the pattern of how Margaret had been treated, ignored, dismissed, pushed aside. Margaret looked up, confusion and frustration dancing behind her tired eyes. "I don't see a reservation sign," she replied gently. "I always sit here at this time," he argued, his voice rising in volume. "This is my spot." I couldn't take it anymore. Something inside me snapped. "There are no assigned seats here," I said, my voice steady but firm. "And she was here first." The man shot me a look of contempt, sizing me up like I was an insignificant speck of dust. "And who are you?" he demanded. "I'm someone who believes in basic courtesy," I answered, meeting his gaze without hesitation. He scoffed and walked away, but not before throwing a final, venomous glance at both of us. I could feel the tension in the air, the weight of judgment pressing down on us. But in that moment, I felt an unexpected surge of pride. I had done something right. I had stood up for someone who couldn't stand up for herself. Margaret, looking at me with wide eyes, was clearly surprised. "Thank you, dear," she said softly, her voice filled with gratitude. "You didn't have to do that." I smiled, feeling a warmth spread through me. "It wasn't right," I replied simply. "You deserve to sit wherever you like." She seemed to consider this for a moment before her gaze softened. "I'm Margaret Blackwell," she said, offering her hand. "It's nice to meet you." I took her hand, her grip surprisingly firm despite her frailty. "Emma Fisher," I said, introducing myself. "It's nice to meet you, Mrs. Blackwell." For a moment, we simply sat in silence, the hum of the cafe surrounding us. And in that silence, I realized that I had just met someone extraordinary. Someone whose story was far from finished. Someone who had been discarded by the world but was still fighting to be heard. The days that followed our conversation at the cafe were filled with an odd sense of anticipation. I found myself looking forward to my daily visits, hoping to sit with Margaret again and learn more about her life. There was something about her quiet strength that called to me, something that made me feel like I was on the edge of an important discovery. One morning, Margaret arrived early, her usual seat already waiting for her. She looked slightly different today, her coat still worn but with a new, unmistakable air of confidence about her. I found myself wondering if something had changed within her as well. Or perhaps it was just my perception of her shifting. She didn't seem frail today, not in the same way as before. Her posture was straighter, her eyes sharper. "Good morning, Emma," she greeted me as I sat down at the table. "I've ordered your coffee already." As usual, I smiled at her kindness. "Thank you, Margaret. You didn't have to do that. But I appreciate it." She waved it off, her smile warm but tinged with something unreadable. "It's the least I can do after yesterday's, well, your kindness." I nodded, not quite sure what she meant by her cryptic words but sensing there was more to it. "I'm glad I could help. No one should treat you like that." Margaret's eyes softened at my words. And for the first time, I saw the weight of her past in her expression. There was a sadness in her gaze, but also a resolve, as though she had carried the burden for so long that it had become a part of her. A part that no one else saw, but that I could begin to understand. "You've been so kind to me, Emma," she said softly. "You deserve to know more about my past. About why things are the way they are now." My heart skipped a beat. Finally, I thought, she's going to tell me. I leaned forward, my curiosity piqued. "5 years ago, I had everything," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. "I was the CFO of Blackwell Enterprises, one of the most respected companies in the financial world. My family had power, wealth, influence, but none of it mattered when I discovered something that changed everything." She paused, her hands trembling as she set down her cup. "I found out that my father-in-law, Richard Blackwell, he was using the company's resources to finance illegal operations. Money laundering, to be exact. Funds from our ethical investments were being siphoned off into offshore accounts, disguised as charitable contributions." I couldn't let it stand. My stomach twisted as the weight of her words settled in. Margaret Blackwell, the woman I had come to admire for her poise and dignity, had been at the center of a financial scandal, a scandal that she had uncovered herself. "Why didn't you report it?" I asked, my voice shaking slightly. Margaret's eyes grew distant again. "Because of my son," she said, her voice tight. "He was already being groomed to take over the company. Richard threatened to destroy everything I had built if I went public with it. And Alexander," her voice faltered, "he begged me to keep quiet. He promised that he would fix it, that everything would be taken care of." "Did he?" I asked, unable to hide my skepticism. Margaret shook her head. "No, he didn't. The money laundering continued, just more carefully hidden." I resigned, thinking it was the best thing to do. I thought if I walked away, maybe they'd fix it, but they didn't. And now I'm here, hiding in plain sight. I could feel my heart break for her. Margaret had sacrificed everything, her career, her reputation, her life as she knew it, all for her family, only to be betrayed by those she had trusted the most. "So, what happened after you left?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "I had nothing left," she said, her voice tinged with bitterness. "The company turned its back on me. My own son, he believed the lies. No one wanted to believe that the Blackwell family could be involved in something so corrupt. So, I became a ghost, a forgotten relic of a life I once had." I sat there in stunned silence, trying to comprehend what Margaret had just shared. She had lived a life of power and prestige, but now she was nothing more than a shadow of that person. Her family had turned on her, and she had paid the price for their actions. It was then that I realized why Margaret had been so kind to me. She had seen something in me that she had lost in herself, hope. I had no idea what my future held, but in that moment, I knew that I wanted to help her find some sort of redemption, even if it meant facing my own fears. "I'll help you, Margaret," I said, my voice firm with a resolve I hadn't known I had. "I don't know how, but I will." Her eyes locked onto mine, and for the first time, I saw something like relief in her gaze. "You don't know what that means to me, Emma, but I need your help with something important. Something that could change everything." I nodded, determined to see this through. Margaret's story had only just begun to unravel, and I was ready to follow wherever it led. As the days passed, I found myself walking deeper into Margaret's world. The more I uncovered, the more I realized how much courage and conviction she had in facing the truth. She wasn't the frail, forgotten woman I had first met at the cafe. Margaret Blackwell, though broken by the past, had a fire within her that refused to be extinguished. We worked tirelessly together, piecing together evidence of the financial corruption at Blackwell Enterprises. With each passing day, I saw the weight lift from her shoulders as she saw a glimmer of hope, a chance to reclaim the life that had been stolen from her. It wasn't long before the truth came to light, and the world saw the Blackwell family for what they truly were, entangled in lies. deception, and illegal dealings. But it wasn't just about exposing the wrongdoers, it was about restoring the integrity that had been lost. As for me, I had to make a choice, one that would shape the rest of my life. Margaret had offered me an opportunity to help her with the mission. But the job I had dreamed of was still within reach. The choice seemed impossible, but in the end, I realized that doing the right thing, standing by Margaret and the truth, was worth far more than any position or salary. Months later, I sat with Margaret in the cafe again. The weight of the past finally behind us. The scandal had changed everything, but it had also brought us closer. And as we looked forward to a future filled with new beginnings, I couldn't help but feel that our unexpected friendship was a testament to the power of integrity, empathy, and the courage to stand up for what's right. To follow more incredible life stories like this, make sure to subscribe to our channel. We share inspiring stories that touch the heart and show the strength of the human spirit. Don't miss out on the next one.